Welcome to Books in Five, where we interview the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. We'll be asking the author five questions, and they will have 5 minutes to answer each one. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he has written. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he has written an excellent new book about the challenges facing the multi-billion-dollar lobster industry. Greg, thank you so much for being our guest on Books in Five. Please introduce yourself, the title of your book, and where you are joining us from today.
Hey, well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, my book is called The Lobster Trap, the global fight for seafood on the brink. And I'm joining you from Guelph, Ontario today.
Great. And just a little bit more about your professional background.
So I'm an investigative journalist for the Globe and Mail. I work on what we call the I team. We do long-term uh, investigative work for the newspaper. Sometimes stories can take 6 months or more, kind of digging into big issues that hopefully can affect government policy and look at big institutions in this country and where they may be getting things wrong. And so that kind of work really allows you to dig into stories in a big way that is hard to do if you're doing daily reporting. So I feel very lucky to do that work.
Let's begin with our first question. Your book reveals so much about the lobster industry and its impact on people and the world. What were your motivations for exploring this topic and the sources that you talked to?
Yeah, so I'm from Atlantic Canada. I grew up in New Brunswick on the East Coast, and lobster was always in the background. You know, my parents were not fishermen, but lobster was a kind of food that would show up at special occasions. And I think I was aware that in the 1990s, when I was a teenager, there was this great lobster boom going on, but I hadn't spent a whole lot of time paying attention to it. And really, it was when I became a reporter for the Globe and Mail. I was the Atlantic Canada correspondent, and I was covering the region. And it was really hard to avoid at that point that everywhere you looked, there were signs of this great lobster boom, and ultimately this fight that evolved over who had the right to catch lobster. And it was in the year 2000, the year 2020, that some of your listeners might recall. We had a big dispute in southwest Nova Scotia over the Mi'kmaq fishermen, this indigenous fleet of fishermen who started fishing outside of the federally regulated season, and it became an international story. We had people burning warehouses and shooting at boats, and there were angry mobs on wharves, and the RCMP ultimately had to come in to restore some peace. But it kind of got me thinking as I was covering this as a reporter that there has to be more here. Why are we so worked up about lobster? Aren't there plenty of lobster in the sea? And that was kind of naively what I was thinking. And the more I talked to people, the more I learned that no, actually, there's a lot of concern about the future of this industry that had, until that point, had really been a great success story in Atlantic Canada. So that kind of started me down a path. I wanted to talk to more people, not just in Atlantic Canada, but around New England and around the world, where we people who import lobster, people who catch it, people who study these remarkable creatures. And this story took me literally around the globe, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work, but for me, I kind of thought if I'm going to tell the story of lobster, you have to tell it from a global perspective because it really has become a global luxury food. It's no longer a regional food, and so that was kind of what guided the process for me, was telling this story and just keep zooming out and zooming out until I've kind of told the global context that lobster is sitting in.
We have about 2 more minutes for this question. I want you to tell us more about some of the interesting characters that you spoke to, because obviously the lobster industry attracts a certain type of person, right?
Yeah, I met all kinds of incredible people. When we look at North America's lobster fishery, it's really it only exists on the East Coast, and so it starts sort of Connecticut and goes all the way up to Newfoundland. And so I covered that ground as much as I could, and I went out with lobster fishermen in places like Connecticut where the lobster have all but disappeared, and they're very worried that it will never return. Right, and in the 1990s, this was the heart of America's lobster fishery, right? And so these folks are describing for me this great collapse in this resource that they thought would never end. And then I went to Newfoundland on the other end of the fishery where they're catching, 4 times the lobster now that they were 5 years ago. So I learned that, depending on where you look in the fishery, it's a much different story. And um, yeah, um, I went to mainland China and met with people who are importing lobster and talked about how much that's evolved and how much it's become a major global market. Um, I really was fascinated to hear from people wherever they were, if they had some kind of connection to the industry. I spoke to Irish fishermen. I went to the UK and France and Ireland, of course, and learned how they're fishing things differently over there, and how really in an unregulated world, how their fishery is the shadow of ours. And I hope to sort of ask the question, like, could that happen here?
Let's move on to our second question. And you've already brought it up, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into it because it's important to understand the evolution of lobster fishing along the east coast of North America. Walk us through some of the history of this region and the major developments in recent years.
Yeah, so I mean, lobster has traditionally been caught on the East Coast for thousands of years, or initially by the indigenous people who were here before European settlers. Um, there's a great story that I come across when I was researching the book, where some of the very first British settlers to Atlantic Canada wrote these stories of finding lobster that were 3, 4 feet in size and so plentiful they could just pick them off the bottom of the ocean. They'd never seen anything like this before. But for the first couple of centuries of kind of what we think of as the modern kind of fishing era, it was still very much a small scale fishery. We're talking about people in little wooden dories and going out, with a handful of traps that they would haul up by hand. Um, the fishery that I'm describing now in the book would be unrecognizable to someone who fished in that era. This is a very modern and massive exporting machine designed to harvest every single lobster off the bottom of the ocean. And the boats are bigger. They're going out to sea longer. They're going out in much more dangerous weather than, say, their grandparents would have gone out in. And they're using modern equipment and modern, navigational aids to kind of help them find where the lobster are in a way that they couldn't before. So, that's come along at the same time, as the world has developed a taste for lobster. They cannot, we can't catch enough of this stuff. So I wanted to explore that evolution, that right as this has become a global food, how has the fishery evolved along with it? You know, um, and now we're getting concerns that we've reached a tipping point, that we're seeing these declines in lobster population. We're seeing declines in lobster harvests, particularly in the southern part of the fishery. So places like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. We're starting to see it in Maine. We're even seeing it in the southern part of the Canadian fishery, like southwestern Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. There's a lot of concern that the catches are dropping and that we may have already passed the peak. And so a lot of people are saying we need to have better science to understand where is this going, what impact are fishermen themselves having on the species, and this is all set to the backdrop, of course, of warming ocean water, and we know that lobster are incredibly sensitive creatures. So as the ocean warms, it's changing all the rules of lobster and how they reproduce and how they defend themselves against disease and when and how they migrate. So there's a lot of people right now studying that question, trying to understand where is all this going, because we know very much that things are changing rapidly underneath the surface of the ocean.
We have about 2 more minutes talking about the East Coast. Can you highlight for us the chapter that you talked about the whaling industry and the conflict that they have with the lobster industry?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the stories I want to tell in the lobster is this tension with right whale regulation. So right now, in both Canada and the U.S., there's a lot of protections that have been brought in to try to preserve the few right whales that are left in North America. And I think most people understand that we need to do this. Right? There may be a few hundred right whales left. Um, and unfortunately, their migration path runs them headlong into where the lobster fishery does most of its work. So they're getting tangled in traps. They get tangled in the lines for equipment. And the fishery is trying to figure out, well, how do we continue to do our work without endangering these whales? And there's a lot of technology that's been developed to try to answer that question. But in places like Nantucket, Massachusetts, which used to be the heart of the whaling industry, there used to be more whaling done there per capita than anywhere else in the world. There's only a handful of people left now who are fishing for lobster, and they were sort of saying to me that now it's swung so far the other way that because of the whaling regulations, it's making hard for them. It's making it hard for them to make a living. So I wanted to just point out there's a lot of challenges facing the industry right now, but this question of how do we protect right whales, but still allowing space for lobster fishermen to earn their living, that was one of the things I was trying to explore in the book.
Let's move on to our third question. You write about the tension that exists in the industry between the various stakeholders. What should we be more aware of as different groups, especially indigenous communities, angle for their share of the catch?
Well, I think we need to know that this is not going away. I think that as a country, we have not really solved this question over who has the right to catch lobster. We have this landmark Supreme Court decision that was called the Marshall decision in 1999, which made it clear that the indigenous populations on the east coast of Canada have an ancestral right to harvest natural resources in order to provide for themselves, and that right, it stems back from these treaties that the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet and other tribes signed with the British colonial governments in the 1700s. So long before Canada was even a country, these agreements were signed. The, the, the where we have debate and tension today in 2025 is what does that look like in the modern context? And there's not agreement over who should regulate the indigenous fishery and who has the right to. And there are some First Nations that say Ottawa does not have. We reject Ottawa's authority to regulate us, and we can fish when and how we want. We don't need federal licenses, and we can fish in the summer, which is a sensitive issue. So for commercial fishermen who have paid, in some cases, $1 million for a lobster license and $1.5 million for a modern fishing boat, they see new arrivals coming into their fishery that they've paid really good money to get access to, and they say, hey, they're not playing by the same rules as us. And this is happening at a time when there's a lot of questions about the sustainability of the fishery. So we do not have this question resolved, even more than 25 years after this Supreme Court decision that made it clear Indigenous folks have this right, and we can't question that. It's what does it look like in the modern context, and how big is it going to get? Those are the kind of things that commercial fishermen are asking. And so for the book, I spent time with both Indigenous fishermen and commercial fishermen out on the water. And my job as a journalist is to try to present both sides. And I hope that people can consider where the other side is coming from. There's a lot of strong feelings on both sides of the issue. But my hope is that people can read this and come away a little bit understanding where maybe the people who have opposing views might be coming from. But like the idea of turf wars and being territorial, that's not new to the lobster fishery. They have been doing this for a very long time. And this happens in the US as well, that, if you lay your traps in a place that traditionally someone else has fished in, I mean, you're likely going to have your traps be cut or your equipment damaged or your traps will be pulled. Fishermen have kind of enforced their own territorial rights for a very long time on their own. So that's kind of the context that this industry is happening in, that fishermen, don't take very kindly to someone new showing up and taking what they see as their livelihood. They will fight in some cases to defend that.
We have about 90 more seconds with this question. Is there an equilibrium price that works for both the producers and the consumers?
Yeah, pricing is a really key part of this whole story. So it depends on who you talk to. Certainly, consumers will look around and say, "Hey, why are we paying $35 for a lobster sandwich?" Right? And that is because that's a product of global demand. The world wants Canadian lobster, and so the price has gone up. The people who catch lobster, fishermen, will say, even though they're getting historic historically high prices. They're saying we've never paid so much to catch these things. We're paying more for fuel. We're paying more for boats. We're paying more for licenses. We're taking greater risks. So they're saying, in some cases, when the price dips, we can barely, pay our bills. And then if you talk to the people who are on shore, who are the seafood companies, the buyers of lobster, they'll say, because the lobster has been booming so much in past decades, there's too many new buyers who've come in who are willing to pay top dollar. And so that's driven the price up. And they're saying now we don't make very much money on exporting lobster. So it really depends on who you talk to in the industry, but there's no question the money involved in lobster is unlike anything we've seen before. And certainly, as it becomes more rare, we can assume that we're only going to pay more for it.
Let's move on to our fourth question. And I want to expand the scope to include the world now,
Mhm.
because I learned so much from the section of the book titled A Global Food. Can you highlight the impact of demand for lobster from around the world on the industry?
I mean, it's huge, right? So you go to places like mainland China, which is now the largest buyer of live lobster in the world. 25 years ago, there were very few people who had ever eaten a Canadian lobster or let alone seen one in mainland China. But seafood companies have built a market there, and they did it in a very relatively short amount of time. And so when you add a new market the size of China, with China's buying power, into an industry like lobster, it really upends all the rules. It upends the rules around how much we're willing to pay for lobster, how we ship it around the world. At the same time, there have been a lot of advancements in the way that we can move lobster globally. In recent decades, we've gotten very good at shipping live lobster on planes and keeping them alive, keeping them just cold enough, just oxidated enough so they could land in Shanghai or Hong Kong or wherever you're shipping them to, with very little mortality, and get them to their destination on the other side of the planet, in a couple of days, which we couldn't do that, a few decades ago, not very efficiently. So as the industry has kind of globalized, so has you know, so has the demand. And so we are seeing that lobster has become this kind of global status symbol, right? In places like the Middle East or China, if someone is having um, a big event, a wedding or a business meeting, and you want to impress people, there's often Canadian lobster on the table. Um, so that's also inflated the price, right? That the image of lobster, which used to very much be kind of a poor person's food. When if we're talking, a few generations ago, it has now become this symbol of prosperity, right? So the Europeans want more of it. We're finding new markets in places like, Korea and Vietnam in a way that we didn't have before. China buys more of it than they ever have. You look at this collectively and you just see, I mean, all the rules of lobster have been turned upside down. And so you can't remove kind of the global impact when we talk about the demand on this species and can it be sustained? Because now there is a year-round market that wants as much lobster as they can possibly get. And we know that lobster is a limited resource. And so the question I'm trying to ask in the book is, how long can lobster handle this kind of intensive fishing in order to meet the world's demand for lobster as a food?
When you were reporting from all these places around the world, tell us a story about the lobster industry that might have surprised you or you weren't aware of.
I mean, I was surprised that something like a lobster roll, which I always, as a kid growing up, thought of was very much uh, you know, it was kind of a casual food, right? When I was a teenager, you could walk into a McDonald's on the East Coast and get a McLobster sandwich, and it was, I think, $3.99 or $4. It was a relatively cheap sandwich that they were making very quickly. Today, if you go to Dubai, you can get a lobster roll might cost you $40. I went to San Francisco, where there's companies selling lobster rolls for $45 US sometimes. It's amazing to me how much people around the world will pay for a sandwich that was always sort of like something you might have at like a country fair on the East Coast has now been elevated to the status of we will pay significant money for something that was always a simple food. It's incredible to me to just see how that's evolved, how a lobster roll is now. It's no longer. It is no longer, the food of the poor. It is a. It is a. It's a status symbol.
And are those Canadian lobsters being shipped around the world as well, right?
Yes, actually, Canada ships more lobster around the world than any other country. Canada catches more North American lobster than anywhere else in the world. So that's one of the things that's important to highlight. There's a lot of different species of lobster, but no lobster is worth more to the globe in terms of what we pay for it than Canadian lobster. So like when we think of lobster with the big claws and the meaty tails, that's a uniquely North American product. They catch lobster in Europe that looks a little bit like that, but it's blue, it is larger, and they pay more for it. But it is a fraction of the size of the North American lobster fishery. There's lobster from Australia and the Caribbean that they'll sell around the world, but those look very different. They don't have the claws that North American lobster do. So yeah, the world has kind of developed a taste for that lobster with the claw, that kind of iconic look, and you can only get it in a handful of places in the ocean.
Let's finish with our fifth question. The lobster is responsible for so much economic activity, but there can be drawbacks. What are businesses, the government, and people doing to take advantage of the opportunities, and how are they dealing with the challenges?
Well, this is it. I mean, it has been this great success story that's brought a lot of money to the East Coast. There's been a lot of entrepreneurs who have figured out that there's money to be made by selling lobster to markets around the world. Um, you know, the tension we have is how long can this be sustained? And we know that there are some communities in Atlantic Canada that if it weren't for lobster, they would be economically they'd be in a lot of trouble. I went to places like Tignish, Prince Edward Island, that you go there now and there's significant Filipino community, and the Filipino community is there because of a massive lobster plant that simply it was growing so much they could not find local workers. And so that's really breathed a lot of new life and a lot of investment into places like Tignish. And we're kind of seeing this in small communities around the East Coast that because of lobster, you have new workers coming in, new families, and they're buying homes. They're buying vehicles, and it's really economically it's been huge. So the question is, what happens if that fades? If those plants close, and we have seen that. We've seen a lot of companies come in and buy up these smaller lobster processors and close some of them in order to have greater control over the industry, and that has huge impact on those coastal communities. So one of the things I'm trying to explore with the book is what's next, because we've learned through history that North American lobster doesn't work anywhere else in the world, and certainly we've tried. Scientists have tried throughout history to transplant lobster to the Pacific Ocean, to Japan, to Texas, to the UK, and try to create a local fishery there using lobster that we catch in Canada. And it's not worked. And it's not worked simply because lobster are incredibly sensitive creatures that have evolved over millions of years to thrive exclusively in Atlantic Canada and New England. It just they will not thrive in other places. And so we are, a lot of people are trying to answer this question is, how do we prepare for the decline of lobster? What happens after this boom passes? Because there's a lot of signs that it is already passing. We have certainly passed peak lobster, if you can call it that. So there are people who are trying to figure out, can we farm lobster? And there are biologists who I spoke to who have shown you can do this in a hatchery. You can certainly grow lobster and do it in a laboratory setting. But the problem is lobster takes so long to reach adult size. You can't do it in a cost effective way, and certainly not in a way that replicates what the ocean does naturally. So, I think there's opportunity there to explore. Like, is farming one of the ways that we could start to hedge our bets as natural lobster populations decline? I think the science is not in agreement, and I think there's a lot of questions about whether or not it could ever be done on a commercial scale. but certainly there's a lot on the line. And we have to get this right because this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And for Atlantic Canada, I mean, it's as important as the auto sector is to Ontario and oil and gas is to Alberta. So we're a lot of people are watching and hoping that we can figure out kind of what the future looks like and can we reach a point where lobster is a sustainable fishery that will be around in another generation.
Just about 90 more seconds with this question, Greg. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact of climate change?
Yeah, you can't talk about the story of lobster without talking about climate change. We know that lobster thrive in this kind of sweet spot of about 12 to 18 degrees Celsius. They kind of need that average for ocean water temperatures. And what we've seen is that in places like Connecticut, Rhode Island, south of Cape Cod, where the water has crept upwards, the lobster have simply stopped being productive there. And we know the ocean is warming. We know it's warming everywhere, but in places like the Gulf of Maine, it seems to be warming faster than other parts of the world. That's a huge problem for a fishery that is so dependent on this one species. So it's part of the reason why we're seeing a boom in lobster in the northern parts of the fishery, like Quebec and Newfoundland, because the water there has kind of warmed to a point that the lobster are now very productive. But in the southern part of the fishery, it's only speeding up their decline. And so we need to, I think, have very frank conversations about the pace of the change because we know it's changing very rapidly. Fishermen will tell you this, biologists will tell you this. There's been a lot of research done on how rapidly the ocean is changing, and that is deeply concerning for people whose livelihoods are dependent on lobster.
Greg, that has been our 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Again, the title of the book is The Lobster Trap. I definitely recommend checking it out. If you're not able to buy it, look for it at your local library. Greg, where can people find you online and your work?
So I work at the Globe and Mail, so they can still find me. Go to theglobeandmail.com. I mean, the book is in most independent bookstores. You can find it on Amazon or Indigo. But yeah, I'm not hard to find, and I hope that if people are interested, they pick up a copy and it gives them something to think about.
Greg, thank you so much for joining us on Books in 5.
Hey, Pavan, thanks for having me. I appreciate this.
The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sudan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.